A Day in the Life. Coach Pulis and Mrs. Freeman. Angel Art for Small Hearts. Mrs. Zavala, Mrs. Kirk, and Mrs. Yancey. Baywatch Lifeguard Training. Mrs. Anderson, Coach Lorton, and Coach Lortoner. Cookies and Crafts for Cook Children's Hospital. Mrs. Montemeyer and Mrs. Koch. Cornhole for College. Coach Stitt, Coach Brown, Coach Nesbitt, Coach Agee, and Mrs. Beatty. Crafts for Christ Haven. Mrs. Schaefer and Mr. Harvat. Creating Art for a Cause. Mrs. Morris and Mrs. Lash. Crochet's Anatomy. Mrs. Crawford, Mrs. Akers, and Mrs. Bass. Digging in the Dirt. Mrs. Phillips and Mrs. Ramos. Handiwork for Heroes. Mr. Ocampo, Mr. Summers, and Mr. Fremmer. HMS Shaping Hearts. Mrs. Lady and Mrs. Rios. Huskies Helping Hounds. Mrs. Mejia, Mrs. Stroop, and Mrs. Lewis. Huskies Helping Our Heroes. Coach Butcher, Mr. Linehan, and Coach Lawrence. Huskies in the House, Mrs. Gibbs, Miss Schultz, and Mrs. Robinson. It's not such a small world after all. Mrs. George and Mrs. Sotomayor. Life Without Limits. Mrs. Knoll and Mrs. Nelson. Making a Wild Difference. Mrs. Davidar, Mrs. Schaefer, Mrs. Dunham, and Mrs. Stavala. Making Senior Citizens Smile. Mrs. Cope and Mrs. Mitchell. Massive Music Mayhem. Mr. Woodrow, Mr. Woolhouse, and Miss Moss. Memories in the Making. Mr. Shelton and Mr. Rayburn. Next Generation Women's Healthcare. Miss Adams and Mrs. McKethan. Picture Perfect. Landscape Photography. Coach Munoz. And Coach Leonard. Positive Potty People. Miss Likas and Mrs. Bratch. Preschool Playday. Miss Sider and Mrs. Wells. Project Linus. Coach Neeland. Tailgating for Good. Miss Carranza, Miss Bowman, and Coach James. Therapy Pals. Miss Freeman and Coach Blake. Weather Ready Emergency Management. Miss Christmas and Mrs. Moorhead.